Hours before takeoff, the same Dreamliner that would later become Air India 171 was already warning its operators that something wasn't right. Fault logs lit up. A stabilizer component was replaced. A motor control unit was swapped out. And yet the official preliminary summary mentions these details only briefly, almost quietly, despite how critical they were to the aircraft's flight control system. So today we're going to walk through what the airplane actually reported, what was replaced, how those systems behave when they're healthy, and why these decisions hours before departure matter far more than they first appear. The story of Flight 171 doesn't begin at the runway in Ahmedabad. It begins earlier that same morning when the exact same Boeing 787-8 arrived from Delhi as Flight 423. As it descended into Ahmedabad, passengers later described a rough, uncomfortable approach, one that the crew explained as turbulence. And to the people on board, that explanation probably felt true. Turbulence is familiar, it's intuitive. You feel the bumps, the rattling, the wobble. But the airplane's own data tells a more complicated story. When an airliner touches down harder than expected, or in a way that stresses certain parts of the structure, the onboard systems don't just shrug it off, they record it. Modern jets are constantly measuring loads, rates of descent, control surface positions, and the forces traveling through the landing gear and airframe. If any of those values cross certain thresholds, a flight data log entry is created automatically. It isn't subjective. It isn't based on a crew member's impression. It's a mechanical fact. So while passengers perceived a rough landing and the captain spoke of turbulence, the airplane itself quietly captured fault messages tied to that touchdown. That's important because human perception can be misleading. Turbulence and mechanical anomalies can feel very similar from inside the cabin. But a data-logged fault is different. It's the aircraft's internal system saying, here are numbers outside the normal envelope. One of those numbers became a key thread in the investigation. The stabilizer system recorded an exceedance. And that one line in the log is the hinge that connects the morning flight, the maintenance actions, and ultimately the decisions leading up to AI-171's takeoff a few hours later. To understand why that matters, we need to look at what the aircraft recorded next. Among the entries generated after that landing was a message that stands out: stab pose XDCR. In plain language, that refers to the stabilizer position transducer, a sensor that tells the airplane's flight control computers exactly where the horizontal stabilizer is. And on a 787, the stabilizer isn't a passive surface. It's constantly being adjusted by the auto-trim system, which relies heavily on that position feedback. So what does that sensor actually do? Imagine you're driving a car, and the steering column no longer tells the wheels exactly where the steering wheel is pointing. You turn 5 degrees, but the system thinks you turned 10, or it thinks you turned nothing. Even a tiny mismatch causes problems. The airplane's stabilizer relies on the same principle, a precise, reliable feedback loop. If the transducer reports the wrong position, the flight computers may try to correct something that isn't wrong or fail to correct something that is. But the situation here appears to go beyond just the sensor. Investigative reporting indicates that maintenance crews replaced not only that stabilizer position component, but also the right-side stabilizer motor and its electronic control module, the ECMU. This is significant. A sensor tells you where the stabilizer is. The motor moves it. The ECMU commands that motor. If all three relate to the same system, why would a crew be replacing multiple parts on the same morning? This is where we step back and ask a gentle question that becomes very important later. What does it mean when both the sense side and the action side of a flight control surface require attention on the same aircraft on the same day? Let's break the components down simply. A sensor failure. The transducer means the airplane may think the stabilizer is in the wrong position. That can lead to odd trim behavior because the auto-trim system uses that data constantly. You might see the nose pitching up or down in unexpected ways, requiring the pilots to step in quickly. An actuator failure, the motor or ECMU has different symptoms. The stabilizer might not move when commanded, or it might move slowly, or in the worst case, it might move unpredictably. For pilots, that becomes an immediate workload issue. Stabilizer motion affects pitch stability and climb-out performance. And if it isn't doing what you expect on takeoff, you have seconds, not minutes, to diagnose and react. Now imagine a scenario where the airplane both reads the stabilizer incorrectly and may also drive it incorrectly. You don't need both to fail to cause problems. Either one can create serious anomalies. Together, they dramatically tighten the safety margin. The key point is this: a stabilizer fault on a modern fly-by-wire aircraft isn't a minor maintenance note. It touches the heart of the airplane's pitch control system, and pitch control is the single most critical axis during takeoff and initial climb. If something isn't right there, if auto trim isn't acting normally, or if the stabilizer isn't where the system believes it is, pilots can be forced into rapid, high workload corrections at exactly the moment when they least need distractions. But in this case, the airplane wasn't grounding itself. After the sensor message was logged, the motor swapped and the ECMU replaced the aircraft was returned to service. It was released after maintenance, meaning it had passed the required checks. Yet as we'll see in the next sections, the stabilizer wasn't the only thing the airplane would flag that day, and those faults would come closer and closer to the moment of departure. By early afternoon, the technical story around Victor Tango Alpha November Bravo had grown far larger than a single stabilizer message. Leaked aircraft health logs show something more complex, a pattern of electrical and control system alerts across the entire day. And when a modern airliner shows a pattern, rather than an isolated glitch, that deserves attention. Fresh faults reportedly appeared about 15 minutes before the aircraft pushed back for the accident flight. That timing is troubling because it suggests the aircraft continued generating new warnings even after the stabilizer motor and ECMU were replaced. For maintenance engineers, this raises an immediate question: did the fault re-emerge? Or is this the first sign of a deeper issue still hiding inside the aircraft's electrical architecture? Intermittent electrical problems are especially difficult. They can appear clear themselves, then reappear under different conditions. A loose connector or voltage instability can trigger unrelated system alerts seconds apart. On the 787, this is amplified because the aircraft relies on electrical power more heavily than older wide-bodies. Instead of pressurized bleed air driving many systems, the 787 uses electrically powered compressors and actuators. That means more computing, more power electronics, and a tighter coupling between systems. So when the aircraft hiccups electrically, the result isn't a single blinking warning light. It's multiple computers momentarily losing a clean signal. In practice, that can produce faults in flight control communications or autopilot components without any of those systems actually having mechanical defects. The airplane isn't falling apart, it's losing clarity in its own internal sensors and data pathways. This is why engineers separate hard faults from intermittent faults. Hard faults stay failed and are easy to diagnose. Intermittent faults vanish before technicians can isolate them. And when they occur repeatedly across different systems in the same day, they become a serious concern because they hint at instability upstream in the electrical network rather than a single failed component. According to reporting from Reuters, some telemetry snapshots around the accident window also reflected emergency power indicators, including rat-related data being present or suggested. Whether these were real activations or flags triggered during transient conditions is not yet clear, but their presence reinforces the picture of an electrical environment that wasn't completely settled. Even if none of these earlier issues directly caused the crash, they establish something important. The aircraft's systems were not behaving normally that day, and that kind of background instability can raise cockpit workload long before a takeoff roll begins. Around midday, mechanics replaced the stabilizer motor and ECMU following Boeing's published fault isolation manual. After checks were completed, the aircraft was released for flight at about 12:10 IST. And at first glance that seems definitive. The airplane was repaired, checked, and cleared. But the operational meaning of released for flight is more nuanced. An airline maintenance release doesn't certify perfection. It certifies that the aircraft meets the minimum requirements for dispatch under approved processes. A release may involve component replacement, like in this case, but it can also include operational checks, deferred items, and MEL-permitted configurations. This matters because the preliminary AAIB report only briefly mentions the earlier stabilizer issue and repair. Independent reporting, including log entries and maintenance summaries, suggests that the day's technical picture was more detailed than what appears in the early public narrative. That's normal. Preliminary reports purposely keep scope narrow, but it does mean we should avoid assuming the issue began and ended with that one component swap. The minimum equipment list gives operators the flexibility to dispatch with certain items inoperative if safety margins remain intact. MEL items fall into categories. Category A items must be fixed before flight. Categories C and D can be deferred for days or weeks. But when the faults involve primary flight control signaling or electrical power paths, MEL options tighten quickly. Recurrent alerts even if intermittent push maintenance towards stricter troubleshooting or temporary grounding. The challenge, however, is diagnosing an intermittent electrical signature when the fault has vanished by the time you open the access panel. A stabilizer message in the morning followed by different electrical anomalies later may not fit cleanly into one troubleshooting tree. So, technicians are forced to rely on logs experience and Boeing's procedures to determine whether the most recent fix actually closed the loop. Again, this isn't about blame. It's about the operational reality sometimes. The airplane says it's healthy at the exact moment you need it to be healthy, even if it whispered something different an hour earlier. And all of this becomes critical because the aircraft's systems behaved normally during taxi and takeoff roll. From a procedural standpoint, it met dispatch criteria. But from a diagnostic standpoint, the day's pattern suggests deeper electrical stress building beneath the surface. All of the earlier issues set the backdrop for the event that ultimately brought Flight 171 down. Because despite the stabilizer alerts, the electrical messages, and the component swaps that morning, none of those faults directly caused the accident. The trigger was sudden and devastating. Seconds after liftoff, both engine fuel control switches moved from rub-in to cut-off. These switches stop fuel flow instantly and are physically guarded to prevent accidental movement. Once they shifted, both engines began rolling back. The crew reacted quickly, moving the switches back to run within seconds. But at that altitude, the engines simply couldn't recover in time. The cockpit voice recorder captured surprise and confusion about who moved the switches, a powerful indication that the crew did not command the change. No normal procedure calls for shutting off both engines after takeoff. This is why regulators immediately ordered inspections of switch locking mechanisms throughout the fleet. Determining whether this was a mechanical anomaly, an electrical interaction, or inadvertent human action will be a central focus of the investigation. This is where the earlier electrical issues matter, not as direct causes, but as context. When an aircraft has been producing intermittent alerts throughout the day, the cockpit becomes a more demanding place. Pilots must continually question whether a new flicker on the panel is important or just another transient. If the airplane behaves unexpectedly during the takeoff climb, the busiest few seconds of any flight, that additional cognitive load can increase the risk of mistakes, misinterpretation, or delayed recognition of a critical change. Emergency power indications, including RAT-related telemetry mentioned in early reporting, reinforce the severity of the power loss during the accident sequence. The ram air turbine automatically deploys only when normal electrical or hydraulic power collapses, meaning the aircraft was already in deep trouble by the time the engines quit producing thrust. Taken as a whole, the day's events show a chain of pressure points, stabilizer sensor issues, repeated electrical messages, last-minute maintenance, and finally a cockpit emergency that began with an inexplicable movement of two guarded switches. None of these elements alone explains the accident, but together they paint a picture of a system that had been unsettled for hours and of a crew suddenly thrust into a crisis no checklist prepares them for.